righty, how's everybody doing? Full belly, sort of? Yeah, it's good. It's wonderful. All right, let's open in prayer. Father in heaven, thank you again for this day and for everything that you give us. Thank you for the food that you have given us and for your word in particular that teaches us how we are to live and who we are as your creatures that you have created and have redeemed and love. So help us now, Lord, to consider your word carefully so that we might better respond to you in faith and know your word more clearly so that we can live faithfully in the world today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we ended the last class basically at the end of the Pentateuch, at the end of Deuteronomy. So just as, you know, the way that Deuteronomy ends is that old generation, the rebellious generation, has died off in the wilderness. They wandered for 40 years and they are now gone. Even Moses himself has died off, and this new generation is now kind of poised on the plains of Moab on the other side of the Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan, to come into the promised land. And Joshua is going to lead them, and he is kind of like, he is a leader like Moses. God is with him. And then, as we begin to read through Joshua, we see that a lot of the same sorts of things happen to Israel by the leadership of Joshua that happened to Israel under the leadership of Moses. So, for example, Joshua leads the people through the Jordan River on dry ground, just like Moses led the people of Israel through the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea, on dry ground. When they come into the Promised Land, after they've crossed through, all of the people are circumcised. Just like with Moses, a similar thing happens. Before he comes into Egypt through the Sea of Reeds, he circumcises his son before he they have the first, his encounter with Pharaoh and the first Passover. Well, there's going to be a new Exodus. There's a new passing through the waters. There's a new circumcision, and then there's going to be a new Passover. The people celebrate a Passover after they have gone through Jordan. So Joshua is this new Moses that is leading this new Israel into the Promised Land. That's kind of the picture that we get when we think about a lot of these things. As we look, we're obviously, this is a survey, so we're not going to look at too many details, but one of the key things that we can notice is that the people are successful in their taking of the land and their subduing of the land as they are obedient and as they are worshipful. And we think about this, the first thing after they cross through the Jordan River, the first thing that they conquer is Jericho. And they don't conquer it with their own might, they conquer it through worship, essentially, obeying God. He tells them what to do, and they do it. And they basically do it through worship and song. The ark goes before them, so the presence of God himself and his people behind him that are worshiping him is what enables them to conquer Jericho. The Lord is with them too when they continue to fight the inhabitants of the land. And we see this faithfulness in that Joshua is always consulting God. Should we do this? Yes, Joshua, you should do this. So there's this very obedient posture that Joshua, as the head of Israel, takes, and he leads Israel in that path of obedience and righteousness. The whole conquest takes about 7 years, and then at the end of 7 years, they are given some rest. They've kind of made this kind of initial conquering of the land. They come in kind of through the middle. Then they have a conquest to the north. They have a conquest to the south, and they have gained a substantial amount of territory. The tabernacle is set up at Shiloh, and we can kind of see that Israel is now kind of, they've had at least a lot of partial success. But it's not complete success. They haven't fully pushed out all of the Canaanites, and many still remain. And many of their idolatrous shrines still remain. And so Israel has to continue on in this conquest. And so as we kind of come to the end of the book of Joshua, the way that it ends is that the land, there's been this initial success, there's been this division of the land. Each tribe has an inheritance. The Levites don't necessarily have an inheritance like the other tribes, but they still have their inheritance. It's kind of spread out all throughout. They have towns and some surrounding farmland throughout all of Israel so that they can teach Israel what God's law says. So all of that has been kind of, allotted and delineated, and there's some initial rest. But there's also this task that remains. They still have to continue to push the Canaanites out of the land. And so that's kind of the picture that we get. There's success, but then there's still further work to do. But of course, their success doesn't quite happen, and that's where the book of Judges picks up. At the very beginning of the book of Judges, the people of Israel, so this is kind of continuing the pattern that we see in Joshua, the people of Israel inquire of Yahweh. They say, and this is in chapter 1, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And Yahweh answers, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. So right off the bat, it looks like they're going to continue on doing what they're supposed to do. They're faithful. They ask God. He answers them, and they are successful. But still in that same chapter, we see that there is also disobedience. In verse 21, we read that the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. And then ultimately, to kind of highlight the lack of kind of perseverance of the people of Israel, the Jebusites actually aren't pushed out or actually subdued until King David. So Israel never really does all that they're supposed to do. It's kind of an interesting thing here. We then hear of the early successes to kind of continue on this kind of these mixed results. We hear of the early successes of Joseph's descendants, but then we also hear of their failure. And then it seems from there to get worse and worse and worse. Beginning in chapter 2, I believe, where we start to hear about their conquest falling apart, the angel of Yahweh comes to them, and he says, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of Yahweh spoke these words to the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept, and they called the name of that place Bochim, which means weepers, and they sacrificed there to Yahweh. So, we have to kind of think about this whole passage here. The people, this angel is coming to them and saying, what in the world are you doing? I promised that I was going to do this for you. I delivered you out of Egypt. I said that I would go before you, and all you have to do is be obedient, but you have not. And so I, Yahweh, am not going to go before you. You're going to have these people that are always pestering you. They're going to be thorns in your sides, and their gods are going to be snares to you. And so then basically the rest of the book of Judges, we see these two things. We see that the peoples are thorns in their sides, kind of constantly attacking them, subduing them in part. And then, of course, there's deliverance that comes from that. There's temptations to worship their idols and their gods, and Israel falls into them, all because they weren't obedient and they didn't trust God from the get-go. And that's kind of the cycle that we see. Towards the end of the book, we read that there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But of course, the fact of the matter is, when we think about this, is there was a king in Israel. Remember the imagery of the tabernacle. The Ark of the Covenant was the throne room, or the footstool, perhaps, of God. That's where he sat enthroned. They didn't have, an earthly king or a king like the other nations. They had Yahweh. Yahweh was enthroned in their midst, and they didn't listen to him. The priests and the Levites, who had the task of teaching Israel what God had said and continued to say, but they failed to do so. So Israel is faithless, and that's why they go through all of those cycles of oppression and then deliverance. And that was kind of the fundamental problem for Israel, is that they weren't properly oriented toward God, who was enthroned in their midst. And I think that's one of the key lessons that we have to remember, we have to take forward with us. There's a proper orientation that is necessary as we go out into the world and try to subdue it and do all of the different ways that we work in our various callings. During the time of the judges is when the story of Ruth takes place. The story of Ruth begins, the book of Ruth begins with, in the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land. So when the book of Judges is taking place, that's also when Ruth is taking place. We're not really given any other kind of time indications other than that. Well, except for the end, when we can kind of count the generations to David some. But that's about it. Naomi, as you all know, is the wife of Elimelech. And interestingly, many have pointed out that she symbolizes Israel. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies, and so do her two sons. And so when we kind of think about this imagery here, along with the famine, this is the part of the point of the story is to show how despairing the situation in Israel actually is. Here's this woman, her husband dies, and so do her two sons. So she is left with, especially in ancient times, she is left with basically no security for her to live. And that's kind of how Israel is. Because of her faithlessness, because she has abandoned God in many ways and doesn't listen to him, she too doesn't have much security. She's handed over to her enemies. She feels the effects of the thorns of their oppressors and the effects of being snared into idolatrous gods. Well, of course, that's not the end of the story of Ruth, right? There's this wonderful story of redemption. They go off into Moab and they come back into Israel. They go to Judah. And Ruth starts to glean in the fields of Boaz, and he kind of becomes her kinsman redeemer is the term. He protects her. The kinsman redeemer would come alongside somebody who was a widow and perhaps marry them, and so that they would have security, financial security, and all kinds of other social benefits as well. I almost said social security, but that has a different connotation these days. But Boaz kind of orchestrates this whole plan. He shrewdly deals with the closer kinsman redeemer. There's another kinsman redeemer who's closer in lineage to Ruth than he is, but he kind of shrewdly kind of almost tricks the guy into not wanting anything to do with Ruth, and so he takes her up and he protects her, and he marries her, and he produces an heir, and of course that heir is a descendant or an ancestor of King David. And so we get this amazingly beautiful story of redemption that symbolizes Israel. Israel is this widow who has nothing, basically. Even her sons are dead. But yet somebody comes along and, the phrase is covers with his wings and really provides the redemption to provide for Ruth and therefore for Naomi. So it's an amazing picture of what God is going to do. He's going to rescue Israel, and he's going to produce a seed through Boaz and through Ruth, this Moabite, that is eventually going to lead to King David. And King David will lead them out of this kind of cyclical this cycle of oppression and redemption into a real fulfillment of what God has called his people to do in the beginning. And so that kind of brings us then to 1st and 2nd Samuel, which really have to be seen, even though they're separate books, there's lots and lots of things that tie them together. One big story that essentially is all about kind of the taking down of the old house, the Mosaic order, and replacing it with a new house, a new Davidic order. That's what I think, not I think, that's what a lot of people kind of point out, that this is how these two books, these two really, really important and influential books, fit into the overall narrative of God's plan and his story. So the Mosaic order has been established. Israel is not faithful, and so it is torn down and replaced with something that is even more glorious. And that's basically the picture that we get, or at least a short summary of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So we see the breaking down of the Mosaic house, and that includes the breaking down of the priesthood and the breaking down of the tabernacle. Those are two, when we think of the Mosaic period, perhaps those are the things that we think of most, right? You think of priests and you think of them working in the tabernacle. But these things are going to be taken down. After the birth narrative of Samuel, which we all know fairly well, he is kind of adopted into the service of the tabernacle. He wears a linen ephod like the priests do. And simultaneously, kind of intermixed with this narrative, we also hear of the wickedness, of the evil of Eli, who is the high priest of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. So Hophni and Phinehas, they're the sons of the high priest. They too are priests, and we're told, they are worthless men. And the text even says, think about how stark of a picture this is. The text even says that they did not know Yahweh. So the very people who are working in Yahweh's house, in the tabernacle, the very people who are to be experts in the law, they don't know who Yahweh is. Furthermore, to kind of continue to highlight their wickedness, they seem to completely disregard a lot of the rules that Yahweh gives. They kind of eat their portion of the offering before Yahweh gets his portion of the fat. They just kind of have complete disregard for God. They just want, whatever it is to benefit themselves. They committed adultery with some of the women who helped to serve around the tabernacle. Now, an interesting point here is there's another Phinehas. We didn't talk about him, but there's another Phinehas back in Numbers chapter 25. And if you recall from that story, he's the one who is so passionate about God's law that when he sees an Israelite man fornicating with a Midianite woman, he stabs them both through the belly. He kills them. And his zeal for righteousness, now that God dwells in their midst, his zeal for righteousness is what, kind of assuages the wrath of God. So that's what the old Phinehas was like. And now this new Phinehas is committing adultery with all these women that serve in the tabernacle. So it's really just an amazing level of wickedness that is happening all over the place. Eli confronts his sons, but, they seem to just not even care. Be quiet, Dad. You don't even know what you're talking about. And so that's the reason why the house of Eli, that priesthood has to be taken down. These guys are wicked to the bone. They do not even care. Through a certain prophet who is just called a man in the text, that this prophet speaks for God, he says, Yahweh, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. Go into the tabernacle, out of the tabernacle, before Yahweh forever. But now Yahweh declares, far be it from me. For those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. And of course, just after this, if we're kind of sticking with the narrative of the text, Samuel is called by Yahweh to kind of be a special prophet of the people. And just after that, the Philistines invade. The Philistines win the battle. The Ark of the Covenant is taken captive, and Hophni and Phinehas are killed. So that prophet that came to Eli wasn't joking. He was speaking the words of God. And then, of course, when Eli hears of his sons dying, then he falls over dead too. So the house of Eli is gone. The whole priesthood, under that line anyway, the whole priesthood is gone. And the tabernacle is taken down. And the Ark of the Covenant is taken away from Israel. Now it's interesting here. So we have to think about how kind of huge this is for Israel. The house of God is destroyed. The throne room of God, the footstool of God, is taken away. The thing that went before them into battle is taken away. So they are without God's presence. This is a huge, huge deal for them. And now all of the priests that worked in God's house are dead. So what are we going to do now? Another interesting point here, Peter Leithart points this out. It's kind of an interesting comparison between some of the other kind of exiles that we see in the Bible. The people of Israel here aren't exiled, but it's God, symbolized in the Ark of the Covenant, that kind of takes the punishment on himself for Israel. Israel gets to stay in the land. Now, granted, of course, God's not living in their midst, but Israel gets to stay in the land, and God is exiled into the land of the Philistines. So it's kind of a neat point, and something that helps us kind of think a little bit more about how it compares with other exiles in the Bible. But while he's there, while he's in exile, of course, he doesn't just hang out. He does battle against the Philistines. He does battle against the gods of the Philistines. Remember, they take the ark and they put it right next to their god, Dagon. And the text says they woke up early in the morning, almost as if to see kind of what happens. And they find that their god, Dagon, is fallen down. His head and his hands are cut off. And in addition to that, while the ark is there, God sends these plagues on the people, these huge tumors, and the people are, just in this enormous distress. Their God has been thrown down. All this crazy, health stuff is happening. So they want this thing out of here. And they return it, obviously, to Israel. And they send with it these, a guilt offering, gold tumors and gold mice, to hopefully maybe atone for their sin of taking the tabernacle. But again, as we talked about, the old order has passed away, right? The priesthood is gone. The priesthood under Eli, anyway. And the tabernacle is gone. So when the tabernacle when the Ark of the Covenant comes back, it doesn't enter back into the tabernacle. The tabernacle is gone. It goes into the house of Abinadab on the hill. And actually, after David becomes king, and then he summons the ark into Jerusalem, it's still in the house of Abinadab on the hill. So the ark just stays there in the house of Abinadab. So the old priesthood has been cut off. The tabernacle is no more. This old Mosaic order is going away, and Yahweh, God, is bringing about a new order. As kind of a transition point, Samuel calls Israel to repentance and faithfulness. And as they gather together, the Philistines begin to attack. So we have to kind of imagine the whole situation here. All this stuff has gone away. Israel is perhaps wondering, what in the world are we going to do now? We've got the ark back, but the tabernacle's gone. The priests are gone. What are we going to do now? Well, Samuel, who's the prophet of Yahweh, he calls them to repentance and faithfulness. And as the whole congregation is gathered together and he's talking to them, the Philistines come marching up. And the people get worried. And Samuel asks God to protect them and to preserve them, and he does. Which is a really kind of reassuring thing for Israel when you think about it. Everything that you knew to be life, in terms of worship, is now gone. What are we going to do now? Well, we still have this prophet Samuel, and Samuel's interceding for us, asking God to help, and God comes through. He thunders, he causes the Philistines to go into complete disarray, and the people of Israel are preserved because Samuel interceded for them. And of course, that's when he sets up the stone of help, Ebenezer, that we sing about in our hymns, to remind the people of Israel that yes, even though the tabernacle is gone, even though the priesthood is gone, at least that line of the priesthood is gone, God is still with you. He's still speaking through Samuel, and he is still going to protect you. And that's what he wants them to remember as they do this, as they continue on. And so that seems to be at least the end of a chapter for a while. Samuel continues to judge Israel until he's very old, and there is relative peace. But then we read also that his sons too are not faithful. They're just almost like the sons of Eli. The text doesn't go into exactly how bad they are. They're not as bad, it seems, but nonetheless, they pervert justice, and they kind of seem like they are self-serving and not there to serve the people, which is what they're supposed to do. And so the elders of Israel come together and they say, Samuel, your sons are wicked too. We need a king. This is what we really need. Now this, of course, kind of brings up the question of, because what they ask for and what they get doesn't seem to be in line with kind of the flow of the story so far. You don't need a king. There's no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's how Judges ends. The people refuse to acknowledge that Yahweh is their king and that he's dwelling in their midst. So why would you need a king? That's kind of the sense that we're getting so far. But remember, way back in Deuteronomy 17, God gives the people of Israel some rules for when you ask for a king, then he should not do these certain things. So it kind of raises the question, are they allowed to have a king or are they not allowed to have a king? And I think the answer is yes, they're allowed to have a king. There's nothing wrong with wanting a king that's going to lead them in righteousness and faithfulness. But the thing that's wrong and the thing that they are kind of chastised for by Samuel is the reasons why they want a king. They want a king like the other nations. They want a king that's going to go before them into battle, to fight their enemies like their enemies fight with them. And that's not the way God has dealt with them at all. He goes before them. He fights for them. He fights their enemies. The people of Israel almost don't even have to fight from like a physical standpoint. Of course they do, but God goes before them to just make it all work out. And they're rejecting kind of that providence that God has promised to do for them. Providence might be not the right word, but you understand what I mean. They're rejecting what God has promised to do for them, and they want a king who's like the kings of other nations, who's going to go before them and lead them into battle. So it's basically, there's nothing wrong with wanting a king, but what's wrong with this idea, with their request, is that they're rejecting what God has promised to do for them. That's kind of the chief problem here. They wanted a king that would be like the other kings, and they've forgotten already the Ebenezer, the stone of help, that big monument that would have reminded them that God will come and fight for you and protect you. So they're forgetting all of the wonderful things that God has done for them and has promised to do for them. Everything that they wanted, they had in God, but they rejected him to have a king like the nations. Samuel warns them, but they don't listen. And of course, they get what they ask for, right? They get King Saul. Now, as we think about Saul, he starts off actually pretty good. There's a lot of descriptions about what he looked like. He was taller. He was handsome. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Remember, we talked about this last time, but Joseph is described as a fine-looking man. So the picture that's being painted by the text is that this is a man who could be a king. He could be a good king. And initially, he is a good king. He inquires too of Yahweh. He asks, what should I do in this particular situation? He is relatively humble, it seems, in the beginning. But then, of course, he falls very quickly. The first time that he sins, Samuel says, wait here for 7 days, and I'll be here in 7 days, and we'll offer sacrifices, and then we're going to go and fight the Philistines. Well, the Philistines are coming up, and Saul gets scared, and he's waited the 7 days, but he still doesn't see Samuel. And so he kind of jumps the gun, and he does the sacrifices by himself, without Samuel. And Samuel comes up, and he rebukes him, like, what are you doing? I told you to wait. And remember, this isn't just like, me telling you all to wait. This is the prophet of God. This is Samuel who speaks for God. And so it's not just like a simple disobedience. It's rather kind of an ignoring of what God says to do. That's I think, the picture that we have here. So Saul jumps the gun. He ignores what God says, and he says, I'll just do it myself. The second sin that he does is with respect to the way that he treats his son, Jonathan. In one of the battles, he tells the men not to eat before the battle, and not to eat during the battle. I guess they'd have to eat before, at least at some point, but not to eat during the battle. And Jonathan is not there while this instruction is being given. So Jonathan kind of goes up and he leads this little skirmish against the Philistines. He's successful. They slay a bunch of Philistines, and he eats while he's doing that. Well, Saul finds out about this little episode, and he is just furious, and he wants to kill his own son. And it's so bad that actually the people of Israel have to ransom Jonathan away from Saul's wrath. So, that's not the picture. That might be the picture of a king from another nation, but that's not the picture of a king from Israel who's supposed to lead people in righteousness. A good Israelite king would have perhaps rebuked him or something like that, but he wouldn't have had this vengeful wrath that just had to had to kill somebody, even if it's his own son that disobeyed him. That's not the way an Israelite king would have operated. Thirdly, God instructed him to devote the Amalekites to destruction. Remember, the Amalekites had fought against in kind of wicked ways, assaulted Israel as they're trying to come into the promised land. And so God is going to wipe out the Amalekites at some point, at least. King Saul goes to battle against them, and God says, I want you to destroy them all. And Saul spares King Agag. We're not told exactly why, but perhaps he was kind of like, he's a king just like I am. I'm a king just like he is, which of course is not the case. That's the whole point. You're not supposed to be a king like the other nations. But here he's acting like a king like the other nations. He's extending some sort of privilege to this other king, perhaps for his own advantage in some sort of way. Now it's interesting here that this comes up a little bit later in the Bible, when the people of Israel have been exiled, and even after some of them have come back, there's still, it seems, a contingent of Jews that stay in Babylon and then in Persia. That's where the book of Esther takes place. Well, if you recall from the book of Esther, Haman is kind of the guy he's orchestrating, he's helping the king to want to, to issue these decrees that destroy the Jews. Well, when you read Esther, Haman is an Agagite. He is a descendant of King Agag. So the guy that Saul was supposed to wipe out as the king of the Amalekites, his descendants come back to haunt the people of Israel. So had Saul been faithful to do what he was supposed to do what he was told to do, then Israel wouldn't have had to battle with Haman later on in redemptive history. So we kind of get, of course, Saul sins a whole lot more. These are the first three sins that, commentators kind of point to. David comes on the scene, and then it seems like he just, goes deeper and deeper and deeper into sin and disobedience and all kinds of stuff. But we see, at least from these first three things, that Saul is truly a king like the other kings. He's not the king that is going to lead Israel in paths of righteousness. He is vengeful, he is proud, he's jealous, and that's not the way an Israelite king is supposed to be. Well, David comes on the scene then, and even though he helps to save Israel, of course, this further illustrates Saul's wickedness. Saul begins to hate him, and as we have talked about some, and you all probably know, the situation between these two just gets worse and worse and worse. Saul just despises him. He hunts after David, and finally he is killed. Saul is killed at the Battle of Mount Gilboa. So now let's think about this a little bit more. The priesthood has been wiped out, somewhat replaced. The tabernacle has been destroyed, and the king that Israel wanted is now dead. So this is truly the end of a whole order, the whole Mosaic order, basically. And a new order is now going to come about under King David. David is anointed king way back in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. But he doesn't truly become king until Saul is killed. And in 2 Samuel chapter 2, he's anointed the king over Judah. And then it's not until chapter 5 that he is anointed king over all of Israel. But even then, he still has a whole lot that he has to subdue. It's really interesting. Again, Peter Leithart points out here, there's a neat connection between David and Jesus at this point. David underwent this long period of humiliation. Even though he's anointed the king of Israel, he still is hunted down by Saul. He has to be on the escape. He's got to be on the run. So he's humiliated to a certain extent. He has to go through that long period of humiliation before he is exalted. Similarly, well, even when he's exalted too, he still has all of this work to do of subduing, going to battle against various Philistines and other enemies. Well, the same thing is true for Jesus as well. Jesus has to go through this period of humiliation. He has to be mocked and scorned. He has to even be killed. And then he is exalted. But even when he's exalted, he still has all of this work to do in subduing the rest of the world. So it's kind of a neat connection here. David is successful, just like we saw in parts of Judges and parts of Joshua. David is successful because and when he honors God. Just like before, he inquires of God of what he should do. Should I go into battle? Should I not? He is patient. Saul, remember, is impatient. He can't wait for Samuel just a little bit longer than seven days. David is patient. He inquires of God. He's the exact opposite of Saul in so many ways. We're even, even in the picture of David and Goliath, you all know that story well. Even a lot of the physical things that describe these two people are polar opposites. Saul is tall and handsome. David is not tall. He is younger. He's perhaps shorter. So we have all of these physical descriptions that help us to see that these men are actually polar opposites, not just in their appearance, but also in the way that they are faithful. And so that's kind of the picture that we are given. David is successful in his campaigns because he is faithful, because he is patient. He is given dominion because he is faithful, because he's patient, and Saul is not. When the Philistines had been defeated, David then, in the early part of his reign, he's pushed back the Philistines. He's pretty well established in the city of David, what is Jerusalem basically. And so he says, we're going to bring the ark up from where it was before, the house of Abinadab, and we're going to bring it into the city of David. So we're starting to see this new reorganization taking place, which of course will kind of culminate under Solomon. There's a new priesthood that has been established. The ark is now in the city of David, or at least it's on its way to the city of David, and it will turn into this really amazing and glorious temple. But as you know, along the way, Uzzah is struck down for touching the ark. The ark is placed on a new cart, something that hadn't carried anything before. It's pulled by oxen, and it looks, something happened, something caused there to be some sort of stumbling, And so Uzzah steps out, or reaches out, and looks like he safeguards the ark, perhaps. And he is struck down because he was not authorized to touch the ark. Well, this scares David. He stops. He says, we're not going to go to the city of David anymore because Yahweh is furious that somebody has touched the ark. So they put the ark in kind of a temporary place. It's the house of Obed-Edom, which is interesting because the Bible's very particular here in pointing out, specific here in pointing out that he is a Gittite. He is from the city of Gath, which is a Philistine city. So he is likely a Gentile, probably a God-fearing Gentile. So the ark, on its way up to the city of David, is housed in this God-fearing Gentile's house. Something that never would have been done before. And perhaps this is signifying that now, under this reorganization, Israel is going to be more outwardly focused. The Gentiles are going to be blessed by Israel in a way that didn't happen before under that Mosaic order. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. So the ark is housed in this Gentile's house. And what do we see because of that? Well, Obed-Edom is blessed. Yahweh blesses him. And so David says, well, man, if Yahweh's blessing this Gentile, then maybe he's not that angry anymore. Maybe we can continue on our journey. And he does. And so they bring the ark into Jerusalem, kind of helping us to solidify and to see that there truly is something new going on, a new organization. There's now a new monarchy. This monarchy is being led by this man who's humble and patient. The ark is in a new place. It's in this fortified city now. And all of that old stuff is gone. So there's this completely new system in place. And then to really kind of solidify this new system, this new order, just after all of this, Yahweh enters into this amazing covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7. In part of that chapter, David talks to God, and he wants to build a temple for the ark. But God replies, I never asked you to do this. I never told you to build me a temple. And this is kind of a long section, but let me read some of this section here from 2 Samuel chapter 7. It's very instructive. It says, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I took you from the pasture, he's talking to David, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all of your enemies. Remember, and as we're doing this, we're trying to see the overarching story. So all of those commissions and promises that we heard given to Adam, to Noah, to the patriarchs, to Israel, all of these things are going to come to fruition, at least in part, under the king of David and, of course, in Solomon. Moreover, Yahweh declares to you that Yahweh will make you a house. David wants to build God a house for the Ark of the Covenant. Well, I'm going to make you a house, God says to David. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men, but my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. So, the old house, the tabernacle house, has been taken away, and all of the priests that went with it. But now God is going to build a new house, which is the family of David. the descendants of David. And one of his descendants, Solomon, is going to build a house for God to dwell in. And we're going to see how these things kind of fit together here in just a second. So the old house has been thoroughly torn down now, and now this new house of David has been established. And then there's a promise that there's going to be the construction of a house for God's name that's going to come through David's son. So remember here, as we think about this, we have to think about how God is continuing to be faithful to his original intentions and how man is going to fulfill those original commissions. And God is going to be faithful to his promises. The dominion mandate is going to come to a fulfillment and a certain expression here under King David and King Solomon. God is showing his faithfulness, his steadfast love to David and to his people. But there's also something else here that happens. So there's continuity with all of that comes before, but then there's also something new. Here, God promises that the people of Israel will be planted and be disturbed no more. So there's a certain amount of peace and prosperity that is going to come when Israel is faithful. Not only are they going to have dominion, not only is God going to be faithful to prosper them and to multiply their seed and all of these things, but he's going to make sure that they are planted and that they won't be disturbed, that no violent men will disrupt them. And really, we have to kind of, think about this. It's easy for us to think about this and, looking back. But had David under this new administration, had Solomon under his administration been faithful, then they would have continued to reach this. And they would have continued to expand their influence and their prosperity. But of course, that's not the way things go. David grabs for things that aren't his. He succumbs to various sins, most notably. We can think of Bathsheba, right? That's not his, and he strives after it. And because he tries to get things that aren't his, that's when the house of David, too, begins to get shaky. At the beginning of 1 Kings, we see Solomon succeeding David as king of Israel, and the promises that God had given to Abraham and David truly, and we can even say to Adam, truly come to a type of fulfillment. Remember in that story in the first part of 1 Kings, Solomon asks God for an understanding mind to govern God's people so that he can discern between good and evil. That's the thing that he asks. This young king wants wisdom. And God is pleased that this is what he asked for, and he didn't ask for wealth or honor or anything like that. And so he blesses Solomon with wisdom. He gives him wisdom beyond anybody else. And he also gives him riches and honor as well. But remember, and some of you have heard this and know this well, but it's still good for us to see this because it helps to kind of fit where, to see where this story fits in the overall picture. Remember the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, way back in the Garden of Eden. That was that tree that God said, he told Adam not to eat of this. Adam had to be obedient. He had to be mature. He had to mature through his obedience. And as he did so, as he matured, then he would have been given access to the tree. And that would have allowed him to truly have dominion over all of the world, to truly be faithful in his task of subduing the earth. But we see the same term here. So the tree is not present, but the same theme is present, being able to discern good from evil, being able to have wisdom. That's what Solomon is granted by God because he asked for it, because he asked for wisdom, because he feared God. That's the way Proverbs starts off. Solomon had this obedient posture, this posture that asked God to give him wisdom and discernment. And God now, as he's working, with his people, bringing them to this state of maturity of kingship under Solomon, he grants this wisdom to King Solomon. He gives him the ability to discern between good and evil. So that thing that was prohibited for a time to Adam is now granted to King Solomon. He's given this amazing gift of wisdom. And that's what allows him to do all of the things that he's able to do. The kingdom is never bigger than it is under Solomon. He subdues more land all the way to the Euphrates River, which is part of the original promise given to Abraham. So he subdues all this land. His wisdom goes out to all the nations. Nations bring wealth and all kinds of stuff into Israel. They trade, there's commerce. But so does the wisdom of God's word go out to these other places. And that's what Israel was supposed to do the whole time. That's how the Abrahamic promise was to come to a certain fulfillment. And we see that in Solomon. But in addition to this, in addition to the ways that Solomon is able to bless the world and bless Israel and bring Israel to this amazingly glorious state, we also see another way that it becomes glorious, and that is with the construction of this new glorious temple. This house that David's house has been established. Solomon is his seed, reigning in his place, reigning in an even more glorious way. And now Solomon is going to construct that temple that would house God in the midst of his people Israel. And we have to see here a couple of connections between this new glorious temple, and the old tabernacle. So this is kind of the completion of that this transition from the old Davidic order to this new order under the monarchy. The tabernacle, let's think about this a little bit. The tabernacle was beautiful and glorious, really only from the inside, right? If you were to come up to the tabernacle, all you would see is goat skins, right, covering this thing. The beautiful stuff was only seen inside. You saw bronze when you came into the courtyard, but the really pretty stuff was inside the holy place, inside the Holy of Holies. Well, this new temple is glorious even from the outside. People can come from far and wide and see this beautiful, glorious temple. And it kind of helps, I think, to symbolize how this new monarchy of Israel is going to really be an outwardly focused thing. To be sure, Israel was to live in ways that glorified God and follow his law and all of that. But in doing so, nations, peoples were going to come and trade with them and see how glorious this way of life was. I think the temple signifies that, at least to some degree. The tabernacle had one bronze basin for water, right? But the temple had 10 bronze wheeled basins, probably at least maybe a little bit bigger than the basin in the tabernacle. And then it had this one enormous basin that's just called the sea. The sea was on 12 oxen. You had 3 oxen facing in each direction. You had this massive sea. The estimates are that it held 12,000 gallons of water. So this is an enormous sea. It truly is a sea. So again, this is helping us to see that this new order centered around the monarchy, this new glorious temple, this is going to be something that really goes out to the world. The sea, remember, represents the world, the Gentiles, the unbelieving world at least. So the glory of God coming out through his law, having his presence there, is going to go out to the world. And this is symbolized in some of the furniture, if you might call it that. The tabernacle had one golden lampstand, but inside the holy place of the new temple, there are 10, 5 on the north side and 5 on the south side. And these things are, these are glorious lampstands, pure gold, not gold-plated, pure gold, beautiful, beautiful things. The structure of the tabernacle, if we think about the tabernacle, what held it up? Well, you had these posts, and in between these posts you had these curtains, right? These curtains that were layered, and the different skins and all that stuff. It wasn't very beautiful or big or anything. Well, the structure of the temple is stone. Big bronze pillars, massive bronze pillars with these, these decorative capitals. Beautiful, beautiful things that could be seen from far, far away. The inside is just covered with gold. The tabernacle had some gold things, but the inside of the temple is just covered with gold. It's massive, right? It's huge. When you look at, renditions of what it might look like to scale, and a person is like the size of one of the little basins, and the temple just soars up into the sky. This enormous temple complex that is very, very glorious. So it helps us to see then that God is truly coming into this. There's this new chapter in redemptive history. It's more outwardly focused, it's more glorious, and truly all of the world will be blessed by it. But one of the other differences here of the temple and the tabernacle is that Solomon's palace is kind of connected to it. It's adjacent to it. And it's when we think about the imagery here, this is pretty significant. It helps us to see that the Israelite king is not just a king like the other nations. His palace is right next to the temple. He is to be the minister of God, to go out and to lead people, lead Israel, to be faithful to God. He is to rule Israel as being under God, as truly being under the Lord. He is to lead them to be righteous and to be faithful. So the glory of the temple is magnificent. Yahweh's house is right next to Solomon's house. And you would think then that he would be kind of inspired to be a good king, but he too falls. He sins in all of the areas that an Israelite king is not supposed to sin in. He collects enormous amounts of gold. I was kind of re-looking through some of these things. Let me just read them to you. He collects every year 666 talents of gold. So remember, the going back to Deuteronomy 17, the Israelite king is not supposed to gather horses and chariots. He's not supposed to, build up his military strength. He's not supposed to gather wives, and he's not supposed to gather riches. And we see that Solomon breaks all of these things. So he's got this enormous inflow of gold. King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches. Also, Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen that he stationed all throughout his Israel in these chariot cities. In addition to that, he loved foreign women, many foreign women. Along with the daughter of Pharaoh, he had a Moabite wife, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and a Hittite women. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. And listen to this, and his wives turned away his heart. So Solomon violated all of the instructions for what a good Israelite king is to do. So when we kind of keep all of these things together, we see this progression from the Mosaic order into this new order, this new Davidic dynasty. It's more glorious, it's more outwardly focused, it's going to bless the world, but when the kings don't listen to what God says, then it goes astray. And that's exactly what Solomon does. And so we're kind of left with then this picture of glory, but then also this yearning for somebody who's going to be greater than Solomon. And that, of course, ultimately happens in Jesus. So we are about at time. We probably have a minute or so. We're actually over 7 o'clock. But any comments or questions? Quickly. Okay, let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you again for your word to us. And we ask, Lord, that you will help us to learn it, and to continue to learn it over and over, that we might glean more and more of its richness, and help us then to apply it to our lives so that we can be faithful as your people and glorify you in all the things that we do. Be with us this evening and tomorrow. Give us good rest and help us to be energized for the work that you have for us tomorrow. In Jesus' name, amen. All righty. Thank you all very much. You're welcome.